Welcome to my talk on Scorpion Vampir. I'm Ronny Brendel, longtime developer of Vampir and now working at Oak Ridge National Lab as a performance expert. I want to just dedicate the first slide to telling you that you should really try out doing performance analysis. It's worth it. If you never did it, there's lots of low-hanging fruit and it will get you excited to do more. And just use it on your pet project, or it doesn't even have to be multi-anything. Just to familiarize yourself with the tools, any tool basically. Right. So one thing I want to repeat from the HPC Toolkit session and from Tau 2 is the sampling versus instrumentation part. So again, sampling stops a program at regular intervals, and it stops the program and then probes the stack, takes its measurements, and it assumes that, for example, the function running runs for the whole duration of the sample. So if you have lots of samples, you have a statistical guarantee that your picture is correct. On the other hand, instrumentation gets a callback on every, for example, function entry and exit, regardless of how small the function is. And it can therefore take, for example, exact function counts, exact timings, and wrappers of functions have access to the arguments of functions. So once you decided which of these two techniques to use for interception, you have the choice of summarizing your information or logging it with timestamps, which then gives you the choice on the presentation side to either present a statistic or a timeline-based view. And those two things are commonly referred to as profiling and tracing. So typically, profiles are information accumulated into buckets, low overhead, typically static representation. On the other hand, traces are way more detailed, can incur large overheads, and interactive presentation makes more sense here. But it's all about trade-offs. Sampling-based tools are usually easier to use because they operate on unmodified binaries, they intercept it, they use debugging information to find out what's going on the stack. Whereas tracing tools need some way of interception other than that. For example, wrapping libraries like MPI, or using the dynamic linker to wrap anything or other libraries, or even relink, or even recompile in the case of source-to-source transformation like in Tau, or compiler-based instrumentation. The next trade-off is overhead. So as John already said, with sampling, you have the choice to adjust your sampling rate, which influences how much time you spend on it and how much data you want to write out. And instrumentation, on the other hand, the event rate determines how much overhead you will have and how large your recording will be. And as I mentioned, accuracy and capturing API semantics, for example, is other trade-offs. And for this reason, most tools actually combine both techniques. So most tools employ sampling and on the other end have MPI wrapping, OpenMP, and CUDA call wrapping to capture API semantics and more detailed information about what they want to present in the visualization in the end. Right. So Vampir is firmly in the tracing part of the world. It's a pure trace viewer. It reads a file and displays its contents, basically. It's a commercial tool developed in Dresden. It is itself parallelized to be able to handle large trace data. And on the other hand, you have the performance collector, similar to Tau, which is called Scorpi. It's developed in Jülich and Dresden and with other partners. It's a bit younger. And it was conceived because the partners decided that they don't want to duplicate the effort of recording performance data across all these tools. Like there's lots of research tools in Europe and in the US, and on the recording side, they do rather similar things. So the idea was to unify that, have one file format, and then just branch out for each tool. And that's how Scorpy came about. Scorpy supports C, C++, and Fortran. MPI and SHMEM for multi-process parallelism, OpenMP and P threads for threading, and CUDA OpenACC and OpenCL for accelerators. And it supports lots of compilers. Some tools don't care about compilers, but we do. That's why I mentioned the compilers we support. And roughly speaking, it has an interception layer with lots of options how to intercept or when to intercept. And once you have your program intercepted at runtime, you then have the choice to either unwind the stack, look at performance counters, take timings, or use your own plugin to inject whatever measure you care about. And from then on, you have the choice to either write a trace or a profile and then display that with the tools in the top row. Those are the different tools. All right, that was the quick introduction to the two tools. Now I'll come to the Scorpy tutorial. So in order to use Scorpy, you first load the module, and then you need to recompile your program, prefixing your compiler call with Scorpy. So you just do Scorpy, GCC main, and the dots. The dots just signify where you can insert arguments. Right, just prefix your compiler call with Scorpy. For CMake and other tools, the workflow is slightly different because we modify the compiler call, and the compiler creates something that is to be run on a job. And on some machines, like Titan, you have a difference between the compute nodes and the head nodes. And so an executable for the compute node might not be executable on the head node. That's why our modified, we have to be careful about our binaries. So we tell CMake, which compiles and runs its own checks to not use our techniques to just switch everything off that Scorpy does. And once CMake is done, in the actual make step, we then intercept and change all the flags that we want to. And via instrumental flags and compiler flags, environment variables, you can customize those two argument lists again. So yeah, slightly different workflow for CMake and other tools. Once you've done that, you execute your program normally. And then what Scorpy will do in the background is create a folder like that. And this folder will contain a profile.cubex file in the default case, which you can then open with the profile viewer developed at Forschungszentrum Jülich, which is called Cube. It's called Cube because of its 3 columns. The leftmost column is the so-called metrics column. The middle one shows the call tree, and the right one shows the system tree. And so from left to right, you click on what you're interested in, and the system tree shows you for each thread or processing element the times for that part of the stack, for example. So that's Cube. Before you run your instrumented binary, you can set lots of environment variables. Here, this slide is just for reference to show you some of the more important ones. Enable and disable profiling and tracing. Enable performance counters, which would be taken on each event, so on each function enter and exit, for example, or on each sample. Filters, I will talk about that a bit later. And setting the memory that Scorpy is allowed to use is also an important one. If you want to create a trace, you just enable tracing, rerun the application, and then the folders looks slightly different and includes a traces.otf file, which is kind of the anchor file of the trace file. And then you can open that with Vampir. That's a screenshot of Vampir. Before I dive into the Vampir features, I'll need to take another detour about overhead. So trace size and overhead for your application can vary greatly depending on what exactly is your code about, and for example, how many small functions you do have. And so you should always do a reference run, and in your instrumented run, you should check the timings too and see that they are within reasonable bounds. So if you don't care about the exact timings as much, you might say 2x is fine, or maybe just 10%. And for this reason, filtering is very important in Scorpy. So we have a slightly different workflow for that. So this is the workflow I've presented so far. Instrument and build, execute, and use cube. And the real tracing workflow is slightly different. You use the profile to get an estimate on your trace file size, and then you create a filter, and then you use that filter to create the trace. So let's show that with an example. You use Scorpy score on the profile.cubex file as before, and then the estimate says 40 gigabytes would be the trace, which is kind of a lot. And you would also need 4 gigabytes of RAM for the recording. If you would use less, Scorpy would flush more often and it would perturb your application. With the -R flag, you can get an insight which regions cause this overhead. So in this case, you have a number of functions that have 500 million calls each, and each one of them is like below 1 microsecond in duration. So those are good candidates of just not recording. And then we create a filter file like that, which just specifies what we don't want to see to lower overhead. So, and then you can use Scorpy score again and give it the filter and then get an estimate, an updated estimate with the filter. So this time we only need 60 megabytes of RAM per MPI rank, and total trace file size will be 400 megabytes. And to apply the filter, you set the environment variable up there. Or with compile time filtering, you can do it like that. This is where I have to say our GCC capabilities are way, way better than other compilers because we have a compiler plugin for GCC which does instrumentation as we wish it to be. We do it after the optimizer. We do it more efficiently than -f instrument function. -f instrument function is the default way of doing compiler instrumentation in all compilers, and they are mediocre usually. So in this case, we have our own plugin which has more strength, and we also can do compile time filtering. We remove the performance collection code during compilation, whereas this one would still incur a bunch of ifs to ask the filter, do we really want to record this function, yes or no? And depending how often this question is asked, it could still be a lot of overhead. Right. That said, we are working on the same plugin for LLVM right now, so that should be ready sometime. Okay, that's that. So that was how to use Scorpy, and now I want to switch to Vampir. All right. So this trace is of Gromex, is a molecular dynamics code that is specialized in simulating proteins. And here you see just the default view of Vampir when you open it. So on the top you have a toolbar with all the what we call displays. So each display is a different way of displaying information about the trace. Below that you have the so-called master timeline, which has on the y-axis all the processing elements. In this case, 4 ranks with 3 OpenMP threads each, or 4 total. And on the x-axis, you have time. And the color you see there means which function is active at which point in time. So you can imagine the stack growing towards you in this case. the bubbles up here is a way of visualizing MPI messages. So in this, we chose the bubbles because those are a lot of messages, and the UI basically decides this is too much to display. The whole screen would just be black, so we'll have one. Now I zoom in a bit until the real lines surface, and then you can, for example, zoom in on one of these MPI send receives, and you can click on the message. You can see between which two partners they are exchanged, and you can see, for example, how many bytes were exchanged. Right. And yeah, every time you click on something, the so-called context view will basically indicate what you clicked on. So I'll zoom out again now. If you're wondering where the function is you care about, you can use Control F. That works in most displays. And for example, you can see where MPI send is. I think I hit enter. Ah, there we go. And then it highlights them, and then you can zoom in and see the parts of the application where the function is that you care about. So that's a pretty neat feature. The next display I want to show you is the zoom toolbar. So as you might have noticed, when you zoom in, this one changes, and it shows you where in the trace you're located. The visualization is very similar to the master timeline, except that the colors are kind of stacked, so it gives you like an activity view, what's going on over time. So here's a bunch of CUDA inits, and here's just MPI inits, and here's more. So it's like an overview display showing you where you are, and you can also scroll and move through it. The next display I want to show you is the process timeline. It shows the stack over time for one processing element. In this case, it's the master thread 0. And all the timeline displays are aligned on top of each other, so they just line up so that you can. So this MPI send receive is exactly the same as this one in the top row, for example. And you can also open multiple of those and, for example, change the processing element to a different one. Right. This display over here in the top right corner is what we call sum function summary. It's like a flat profile, and in this case it shows a bunch of OpenMP for loops. If that's too difficult or if that's confusing, you can use the right-click menu again and, for example, group them by function group, and then you have a slightly better overview. And in the right-click menu, you have lots of options, for example, to display as a pie chart rather, or to use percentages, all kinds of things that lets you, for example, customize your screenshots. Right, the flat profile. And down here, you have what we call the function legend. It just shows you which color means what. And if you, for example, choose to change a color because, let's say, this kernel is important to you and you kind of want to have it not as orange, you can click on this box, change its color to, for example, yellow, and then it's yellow everywhere. And yeah, this is a nice way to customize basically what you're seeing. And the legend will also reflect the changed colors. And also here you can click on the boxes and change the colors again. So it's very customizable in that sense. So those are the basic displays. When you want to look at performance counters, you open the counter timeline. In this case, it displays the total number of cycles over time. Not particularly useful right now, it just serves as an example. The red line is the maximum on a pixel. The other yellow line is the average on the pixel, because technically speaking, a pixel is a time range from start to finish of the pixel, and we have to somehow decide what to render there, so we render both. A slightly different way of displaying the same thing is using the so-called performance radar. It shows a counter, in this case also total cycles, for all processing elements this time, and the value is encoded in color. Before I'll dive deeper into this one, I want to show you that you can create custom metrics, which landed on my screen. Okay, that's a big window. So we want to create the custom metric instructions per cycle. And for this, we need to divide the instructions, right-click, add metric, total instructions, total instructions retired, and divide it by the number of cycles. Okay, and then we save that, and then we press OK here, and then we can switch to it in the right-click menu, and this shows us the IPC. I'll just close this one in the meantime. This shows us the IPC over time for each processing element, and then there's lots of IPC up here on master thread 0, which I can tell you is just busy waiting on logs, so it's not, it's just artificially high IPC. This stuff in the middle here is all green, so what you can do is you can customize the scale a bit to make the range more tight, so you have a better, a better overview, or rather more nuanced color, I guess, while investigating. So this one looks better than the just green blob from before. Then you can look into these things, zoom into it, and correlate it with what's up here. Because it's kind of the same display, it's just that in this case it's counters, and up there it's functions. Yeah.
So when you're computing the IPC, for what interval are you computing? Is this from entering to leaving a function?
Yeah. Yes. So technically, we don't care. Practically, Scorpio records it from function enter to exit. Yeah.
So then all the calculations down the bottom are, you're showing them for sort of brief intervals.
I think that's because the range is out of the color range. I believe that's what happened. Yeah, exactly. There they are.
I see.
So yeah, you can also make values that are too small invisible if you.
But then it's computing it from entry to exit of the function, and so changing the IPC at the function called granularity, or recording it. Yes.
Has its ups and downs, right? It's not like a clear cut. All right. Now I want to switch to a different trace file to give you an idea what CUDA could look like. So this is a particle in cell on GPU developed at HZDR in Dresden, I believe. It has a few MPI ranks. I think there's more down here. A number of CUDA streams and a number of threads. So it's all in one picture, which is very nice. And then again, you can zoom in and, for example, look at individual data transfers to the GPU. You can get insight into these things. One of the things you can see here is GPU idle. There's actually an extra counter in Scorpio that records whether or not the GPU is idle at any given time. And you can also collapse all the streams if it's like visually too much. You can just group CUDA streams and then they vanish. And then you can group threads together. So now you have a bit more room and those things are still kind of there. Right. The next trace I want to show you just highlights the extreme scalability. This button here is one of my favorites. Adjust process bar height to fit the chart height. So regardless of how many bars you have, it tries to squeeze them all in. So in this case, this is a WARF code. I think it's just the coupling that's traced here, called FD4, on a BlueGene L or P in Jülich. So this is 16,000 bars squeezed into this. And yeah, again, you can investigate that and try to see what your code is doing or where performance lies. One display I haven't shown so far is the communication matrix. This example lends itself better to this. There's too many windows open. The communication matrix just shows MPI activity split by sender and receiver, so you can see from where to where messages are sent, in this case the number of messages. You can also switch the metric to, for example, message volume. And again, as usual, you can zoom in or customize the scales here. The last feature I want to show you is the so-called comparison view. So for this, we create a new comparison session. What just happened? And we remove those two, and we remove those two. And this up. So what we tell this now is compare these three traces. So those are the three separate trace files, and we want to compare all of them. So what Vampir does is it opens all three at the same time, gives each one of them a slightly different background color. Oh my God. 1 second. Each one a slightly different background color, so that you can now tell which is which. And this is an example where a user tried to improve a GPU code and ended up making it slower at first and then making it faster. By holding Control, I can move the trace along the timeline to line them up. And what I want to do is zoom into the interesting part. Something like that. So yeah, this shows one iteration. Before, after an optimization, the kernel is kind of smaller, but NVProf reported that there are gaps between the kernels that shouldn't be there. And that's a preparation function that tries to estimate how best to configure the kernel to run fast, but this function runs for way too long. And so the user determined which function this is and optimized it. And now the kernel down here is very, or the kernels down here are like about half of what they used to be. And yeah, this just demonstrates the comparison view. Nice for screenshots, nice for getting an idea of what changed. Right. And another user, for example, does this with Scorpio and Vampir. He has a very detailed screenshot of one iteration of his application, that's QMCpack. He just colors all the functions very differently, actually, to help him visually. He labels everything and then uses it in presentations and shows his bosses and other people what he did in Vampir. Okay, that's the demo part. So once you use Scorpy, you might have questions, and this is just a number of resources that is helpful. So the -- help messages are usually good. The manuals are okay. We have 2 different websites because it's 2 different tools and 2 different support email lists for both tools. And the ALCF website for Vampir, for example, is really good if you have questions about these things. And if you want more training materials, VIHPS has lots of those like multi-day tutorials on all the techniques and all the tools, also Tau. So this would be a good resource to look for more information if you want to dig in yourself. Scorpy and Vampir provide holistic, powerful, detailed performance analysis. Main strengths are everything is in one picture, very detailed MPI analysis, very scalable, very customizable, where customizable also sometimes means if no tool works in Scorpy, sometimes you can dial back the analysis or what you record and get something out of it rather than nothing, which can be helpful. We are very active in development, so we're adding OpenMP2 support like all the others. We're trying to get better at I/O analysis and add more information for ADIOS, HDF5, and NetCDF and POSIX I/O, an LLVM compiler plugin, and, for example, non-volatile memory specific metrics. And for these reasons, we have been continuously selected for the last at least 7 years by the OLCF to satisfy their high-end performance analysis needs. So this is just a thank you to our sponsors and projects, and I guess highlights how much work actually goes into these tools. And a list, hopefully complete, of all our contributors. And that's it. Yeah.
So you said Scorpy is open, but Vampir you need a license, right? Or
Yes.
So for a small research group, how much would such a license be per year?
I think it's very individual. I'm actually not sure about the license, what they cost.
I guess around like $100 per year or $1,000 per year.
I think your best bet is to use the demo license initially. It's like limited to, let's say, 16 or 32 processes and trace files of a certain size, I think. And after that, I think a couple $100 at least. I'm not sure, to be honest.
I can tell you that at the OLCF, our total costs are maybe $10,000 a year or something like that. Probably even less than that. So for a smaller installation, it shouldn't be that much, really.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
I heard that the Vampir trace.
Yeah. It's the predecessor of Scorpy. It's not supported anymore. Some people use it still, but it's like gone for like 5 years by now. But yeah, it's the same people, it's the same institute.
The environment is like should be almost the same as the Scorpy and Vampir.
The what?
The system or the usage or functionality is like how now the difference between the.
So Vampir Trace is a pure performance data collector, like Scorpy is, and the features should basically be the same. Scorpy probably has more by now.